for the last couple of decades, I really do think that someplace like Dubai is much more important as a place that has been used self-consciously as a kind of a template and a model. I mean, I think the current British Conservative Party really sees Dubai as not only a place that they should look to for like lessons on how to reorganize the British economy, but also a place, as you're suggesting, that they're already actively working with economically. People see Dubai and they think of it as a wonderful place. I mean, this is something I mentioned in the book, is when these nation branding consultancies started taking off in the early 2000s, they discovered to their surprise that actually your reputation wasn't damaged if you were an authoritarian government, as long as you were seen as being efficient, productive, growth-oriented, glitzy, having opportunities for luxury and investment. Even when it succeeds in the form of Canary Wharf, which is basically a huge giveaway to developers. The state builds infrastructure on behalf of private actors. Most of the money gets either put on conveyor belts and taken outside of the country, or else the spaces of residential real estate gets used as kind of glorified safety deposit boxes for investors from abroad. And on top of that, you can't even have the same rights of protest or organization that you would expect in a kind of workaday street anywhere else in the country.
Quinn Slobodian, hello.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
Doing great.
Excellent. Welcome to PoliticsJOE. We're here to talk about your new book, Crack Up Capitalism, which is excellent. I've really enjoyed it. Before we get into that, it's a very weighty book, lots of heavy themes, expansive themes. Before we explore them, can you just explain who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a historian. I teach at a place called Wellesley College near Boston in the United States. And I also write a lot for newspapers and magazines, and this is my way of kind of intervening into the political debate.
Yeah. So I think your book, what the issues your book exploring, they relate to world economics and the history of capitalism and its relationship with democracy. There's a new orthodoxy, isn't there, that people say the nation state's back. They're taking back capitalism. They're taking back commodification. It's coming back. Globalization over. Nation state on top once again.
Exactly.
You say that's not quite right.
Yeah. That's right. In fact, that's sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book in the first place, was a kind of dissatisfaction with that either or binary you described, that it was sort of like, so the narrative went, we had globalization since the end of the Cold War, and then 2016 came along and Brexit and Trump supposedly shattered that consensus, and we were all stuck back at the nation. And since then, you've been left with this kind of unsatisfying choice of kind of one or the other. Do you defend globalization in the status quo version, or do you say we need to pivot back to more national level control? And as someone who's been reading a lot of anthropologists, geographers who are interested in how capitalism works, it's crystal clear that things don't just operate at either one scale or the other. That in fact, the way that finance works, manufacturing works, any kind of services are all happening at concentrated levels below the surface of the nation. And so if you want to understand inequality or political representation, lack thereof, you have to go searching for kind of spaces that exist below the envelope of the nation. So the book was kind of like, what is that below the nation? What is it politically? What is it practically speaking? And how might it sort of help to give us a more expansive political imagination than the one we're currently stuck with?
And you call these areas zones. What's a zone?
Well, a zone is technically, it's a place that's been kind of ring fenced off from the rest of the nation and provided with a different set of laws, regulations, often that are more friendly to labor or more friendly to mobile capital, often giving more power to corporations than individuals. A classic example here in London is Canary Wharf, but other places like Shenzhen or Dubai in certain ways are places where investors can kind of come in and carte blanche and a la carte pick their own kinds of laws and regulations that are going to work inside of the regulatory framework of the nation.
So we're coming to Canary Wharf in a bit. I just want to kind of talk about, how did these zones come to be?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book is the last one I wrote was this book called Globalists, and it ended with this moment where Milton Friedman was standing in Hong Kong in 1978. This is the high point of social democratic demands in places like Britain and the United States. It was a time where new nation states were asking for more global redistribution. It seemed at that time like national self-determination was kind of on the march. And Milton Friedman was standing in a crown colony of Great Britain and saying this wonderful old artifact of empire actually looks to us like the future. And what made it look like the future to him was that it was a place that was designed mostly for economic freedom without the pressures of democracy. And as it turns out, this is where the genesis of the zone comes in. He wasn't the only one who was fascinated with it. The Chinese Communist Party was also watching very closely the success of Hong Kong and decided to basically emulate and model a similar version of sort of miniature Hong Kongs on their coast from Shenzhen into Guangdong province. So the opening of China really begins the kind of mythology of the zone, because this idea becomes sort of widespread and popular amongst development experts and investors that you can subdivide a nation into areas that can make it more attractive and safer for people to come and invest. So that's one storyline. There's other storylines about like the Shannon Airport in Ireland, which used to be a place where planes needed to stop to refuel on the way from North America. So because it was a site that was kind of outside of national borders, they introduced duty-free areas, and then they introduced kind of tax-free manufacturing centers around the airport. Other countries looked at that and said, maybe we could do that here in Taiwan, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and so on. So this idea of sort of perforating nations is something that sneaks in from the story of tax havenry, from manufacturing, but all sort of converges on this novel kind of political geographical unit that I call in the book the zone.
And you mentioned it was for the benefit of labour, but you meant in the sense that there's more labour, that labour can be more efficient for capital rather than there being greater rights for workers.
Yes, exactly. Often there were sort of fewer rights to organize, fewer rights to kind of express protest or express discontent with the way things are, right?
I think that's a really interesting point about people don't really realise how you hear about free ports, etc. And that's quite. I've never been to a free port. Most people probably will never go to a free port.
Right.
But people in London might have gone to Canary Wharf.
Right.
A concrete example is I was trying to do Vox Pops in Canary Wharf, and a security guard came over and said, "You can't do that."
That's right.
And I said, "No, this is a public highway." He said, "No, it's not."
No, it's not.
And
Right.
I was baffled. It's just it's how can this entire stretch be not public? Like, how do you not have the same rights in this area that you do 200 yards away? It's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you had a close encounter with a zone right there. I mean, so what you experienced was exactly the thing that makes it attractive for investors and for developers in the first place, right? Actually, Canary Wharf is a completely appropriate example because when Friedman is standing in Hong Kong in 1978, literally 6 months later, Geoffrey Howe, Thatcher's first chancellor of the Exchequer, is sitting in a pub at the Isle of Dogs, saying exactly the same thing Friedman is, which is like Hong Kong, not just a weird old artifact, could actually be a model for how we can reinvigorate deindustrializing cities and towns and places like Great Britain. And indeed, from that moment, the first Thatcher budget included a proposal for a series of enterprise zones, which carved out space inside of inner cities, the Isle of Dogs, for example, Liverpool, for example, gave greater rights to developers, took away rights from local municipal governments. The Greater London Council is obliterated shortly thereafter. So this idea that you can have a new set of rules that are designed in favor of one set of people rather than the people at large is the kind of the core selling point of the zone. I mean, the fascinating thing about that is that you had in that budget X number of enterprise zones and a handful of free ports too, 1980, very first budget. Almost the exact same free ports that you have in Sunak's most recent budget. Some of the people who were advising on that first budget, for example, Almond Butler of the Adam Smith Institute, sitting on the advisory council for free ports for Boris Johnson and later for Liz Truss. So the idea that that could be presented as some kind of novel idea is actually hilarious. I mean, it's literally been around since most of us were born. And with the same kind of disappointing results, right? Even when it succeeds in the form of Canary Wharf, which is basically a huge giveaway to developers. The state builds infrastructure on behalf of private actors. Most of the money gets either put on conveyor belts and taken outside of the country, or else the spaces of residential real estate gets used as kind of glorified safety deposit boxes for investors from abroad. And on top of that, you can't even have the same rights of protest or organization that you would expect in a kind of workaday street anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, and locals or residents close to Canary Wharf, if they work there, they work in kind of like the underclass. Almost, right. They work as doormen, as cleaners, etc.
Right. Exactly. And so that's, I think, a really essential part of the story I'm telling in this book too, is that the zone often imagines itself, if it's a place that's inhabited by, let's say, high-end financial services workers in a place like Singapore or Dubai or Canary Wharf, as a place that somehow is autonomous and it exists sort of in a purified kind of bubble. But in all these cases, they're completely dependent on a kind of a hinterland, a reserve supply of labor, like just beyond the gates of the zone, so to speak, that can be brought in when they're required and ejected when they're no longer required. And a place like Dubai, where you have, almost 90% of the population is not citizens, means that 90% of the labor force can be at any point just told to leave. And that is a core part of the vision of the zone. So when people talk about free ports as miraculous policy ideas, what they're saying sort of subtextually is also we want to be able to turn labor on like a faucet, bring it in we want, and eject it when we no longer want it. And that's, for me, one of the more kind of politically disturbing parts of that imagination.
I think what is especially interesting about Canary Wharf and its existence is it was nearly so different. You mentioned the Greater London Council.
Right.
They had quite radical plans for like municipal socialism.
Right.
How they were setting up dialogue with local residents. How can we make this area of like derelict docklands? How can we make it work for you?
Yep.
And the state and capital hand in hand said absolutely not.
Yeah.
This is for us.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things I like about the chapter is I was able to draw on the excellent work of other historians and people who have been writing about the kind of alternative imaginations, like the People's Plan for the Docklands was very different from what came to exist. The GLC, the Greater London Council, is fascinating because the things they were doing then were often seen as kind of like fringe, like almost hippie, way too out there kind of radical things. But what were they doing? They were doing things like, how can we have useful technology and put that in the hands of people? How can we create like kindergartens and daycares that are operated by parents and are more accessible to people from especially different immigrant backgrounds? So they're doing a lot of outreach to new arrivals to the UK and people who were maybe not proficient in English. They were even doing things related to kind of greening and kind of reducing car usage and making it easier to take public transit rather than private transit. So the kind of kooky stuff that all got squashed really by the Thatcherite moment is stuff that only now people are sort of clawing their way back towards. And they were just also just like sort of exuberantly creative and interesting people in the sense that, for example, they got together with someone who had a barge, someone who used to work the barges there, and put attached to the side of it a huge dragon that was shaped like the Thames, which became their logo, and took it up the river and delivered it straight to Westminster, in a kind of celebratory, festive kind of a spirit. So part of the book's back and forth is like, yes, you have this one kind of cold, bloodless model of like perforating and tearing up territory, but you also have often resistance, which is often forgotten because repressed and marginalized, but which I think gives for people on the left like me some hope and sort of something like a usable past that we could go back and figure out how to restore somehow even in a more difficult environment.
Mm-hmm. And then all these decisions taken in the 80s to invite capital in, to give them kind of unbridled access just to land, that you come in and experiment and do what you want. We're really starting to seeing the repercussions of this. A really good example being the P&O ferry scandal, where P&O sacked all of its British workforce with no notice, and people were like, how can this be allowed to happen? And the answer is because they were in a zone, essentially.
Right, exactly. And this, I mean, especially bringing in Dubai and Hong Kong and Singapore was really important for me for this book, because if someone were to ask you sort of like, what's the prototypical neoliberal state? I mean, people might say, if they're really critical, like Pinochet's Chile, or they would more likely say Thatcher's Britain or Ronald Reagan's United States. But for the last couple of decades, I really do think that someplace like Dubai is much more important as a place that has been used self-consciously as a kind of a template and a model. I mean, I think the current British Conservative Party really sees Dubai as not only a place that they should look to for like lessons on how to reorganize the British economy, but also a place, as you're suggesting, that they're already actively working with economically. So DP World is the sort of state-owned logistics company that sets up ports and harbors all over the world. And they owned P&O Ferry. They owned the P&O shipping lines, which was sort of like the grand imperial ferry and shipping service of the British Empire in the 19th century. And it was because they owned it that they could sack everyone overnight, because it was only answerable to the legislation of wherever it was flagged or for who owned it, rather than the domestic authorities. the fact that Britain, had the CEO of DP World on the advisory committee post-Brexit to help to reconfigure the economy, the fact that Britain was actually going in with DP World on some of the construction of ports and harbors in the west coast of Africa, suggests something which is kind of disturbing but true, which is that people see Dubai and they think of it as a wonderful place. I mean, this is something I mentioned in the book, is when these nation branding consultancies started taking off in the early 2000s, they discovered to their surprise that actually your reputation wasn't damaged if you were an authoritarian government, as long as you were seen as being efficient, productive, growth-oriented, glitzy, having opportunities for luxury and investment.
So the World Cup's a great example this year.
Right, exactly. So now, especially with Saudi Arabia also moving into the kind of soft power world of cultural events, climate summits. I mean, how hilarious is that? Places that are like, individually responsible for the highest levels of carbon consumption per capita of anywhere in the world are now presenting themselves as sort of the tribunes of a climate transition is comical, but it would be funny if it wasn't so sad, which is that I think authoritarian capitalism that is seen as effective is still looked to by many governments as a lodestar for self-organization, well, even if the question of democracy or indeed human rights is sort of completely trampled and left by the wayside.
I suppose Dubai is also a very good example of, you say in your book, there's an attitude of, if we're going to be authoritarian, let's make it work. As in, you can go move to Dubai. Like lots of people in Britain do it. Like say you're 20, in your 20s, 30s, you move to Dubai, make way more money, say as a teacher, so you pay no taxes. It's sunny. You can go to the big indoor ski slope, the biggest indoor ski slope in the world.
Right.
There's lots for you to do, and that makes it attractive. No one's going. If they would object, say we're going to actually democratize Dubai, and all these aspects of your lifestyle are going to plummet. I think it's a really important thing to consider when they attract authoritarianism can make itself attractive.
Absolutely, and this is, I mean, one of the things that sort of hangs over this book is the history of the British Empire. So the first 4 chapters are like Hong Kong, Singapore, London, Dubai, and it seems like the world of sort of high tech, high glamour Emirates and Dubai in the 21st century is like miles away from the history of the British Empire. But part of my argument in the book is to sort of bring that older history into the newer history, not only in the sense that if you were young and ambitious and enterprising as a young man in the 1870s, maybe you would go out to the colonies and like try your hand at some business locally and see if you could build up a reputation and come back, similar to the way people go off and act as like an asset manager in Dubai for a couple of years and come back with a nest egg. But also because if you look at it with an economic lens and through the lens of capitalism, the empire wasn't just like one big civilizing mission where everyone was made to sort of, be transformed in the image of the mother country. It was actually all about creating these strange little different forms of legal jurisdiction. So there was crown colonies and concessions and protectorates. And Dubai itself was part of what was called the Trucial Coast, the Trucial States. They had to invent a word to describe what the Emirates actually were, because the relationship between, the UK like protects trade, it protects security, it doesn't tell people exactly what they have to do, is actually creating a kind of a seam in capitalism sort of organization that you can capitalize on if you're smart. You can be like, oh, that means I can bring stuff in here, it doesn't get duty on it, and that means I can take it out of there. And that's still how capitalism works, right? And so I think there's ways that we can see these zones as kind of like the inheritors of that imperial legacy of sort of legal pluralism and territorial diversity, which can help, I think, also make sense of what can also seem weird other times, which is like, what does the legacy of the British Empire, which seems so distant and based on like, certain ideas of like masculine valor and military and martial virtues. You walk around London, I walk around London and see the monuments like along the Thames and stuff. It can seem very foreign. It can seem very disconnected and detached from the kind of world we live in. But if you think of Stamford Raffles standing in the harbor of Singapore and saying, I came here, I found a legal loophole and I made $1 million, then you're like, oh wait, that starts to be a bit more like the attitude that often young people have. In the free ports, what are they except kind of creating internal colonies? I mean, it's kind of creating states of exception inside of the mother country now, when you can't go anywhere else to go and make your colony, you make it one at home, right? You recolonize your own mother country, which is, unfortunately, I think the way that one can understand this sort of boomerang effect of imperial practices brought home in an age of sort of hyper-capitalism.
And then, as well as these internal colonies, there's things like the China's Belt and Road Initiative, having traditional colonies, I suppose, building infrastructure in the global south, and then also projects like Saudi Arabia's, is it NEOM? Is that how you say it? Or
I think so. NEOM,
it's all capitalized. Yeah. Is it NEOM
you have
city?
To shout it. NEOM!
NEOM! It's here! Which is, it seems like something from fantasy, doesn't it? It's just this ultra-futuristic city where everything's going to be great, funded by the most oppressive one of the most oppressive regimes in the world.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese Belt and Road, which is, went from being something that seemed like it was going to take over the world 4 years ago to something that is now almost falling into receivership in one country after another, is a perfect example of the kind of stuff I'm describing in the book. Because if you look at the way that the British Empire expanded, they basically also touched down in little coaling stations and trade ports and free ports, whether it was on the Arabian Peninsula, Singapore, India. And so they often had a really light footprint, or their concentrated population, concentrations of power and money and trade. Dubai was very good at sort of looking at that. Singapore is very good at looking at that and being like, let's take over the old British Empire's model. And so Singapore starts building ports and shipping centers all along that same chain of ports. Dubai does the same thing. With the Belt and Road Initiative, you kind of get China, which had first sort of self-Hong Kongized in a way, now kind of going global and setting up and retracing the steps of the British Empire sort of backwards, back to the source, right? And so by the high point of Belt and Road Initiative funding, my favorite moment, that comes somewhere in the book is Boris Johnson, breaking ground next to someone from Beijing, saying finally we have big new investors for the expansion of the Docklands. Right, and he had this famous statement where he said, the 10 richest investors should be given sort of knighthoods automatically, even if they're not even British citizens, because we rely on the ultra-wealthy people. They are actually our life's blood. I mean, the kind of stuff where you're like, what the hell kind of populism is that? I mean, this is really bizarre.
Who does that appeal to?
This is really strange. Yeah, I mean, it appeals to overseas investors, which is who the audience was. But that very place, that was set up to be the new Canary Wharf is now just a ghost town, right? It's just sealed off and empty. Because when you set up your whole business model as a country around, supplicating yourself and making yourself as hospitable as possible to bend over backwards and contort yourself for the desires of foreign investors, even if they're other states like the Chinese, then when conditions change, you're left high and dry. And it's sad to think that, the well-being of the British people and the British economy is dependent on just kind of the whims of, in this case, a quite definitely undemocratic form of capitalism on the other side of the world, right? It seems not sort of up to the kind of the possibilities of the rich tradition of kind of collective self-care and pride that Britain actually has.
I think it's a case of the government, various governments around the world reaping what they sowed. They invited these people in. They needed the state. They don't need the state anymore. So they're now trying, the masters of the universe, the global financial industry, is trying to kind of undermine what it is, and it's the British state is stripping away its assets to make it more accessible to these things. I think it's just dangerous, isn't it?
Well, I think that the problem is, it goes back to the way you started with, which is sort of the nationalist backlash debate from circa 2016, right? So I think that if you have sort of reconfigured your economy such that you need to be reliant only on foreign investors to survive, and you think that globalization is a natural process beyond the control of any politician or any state, and the only thing governments can do is kind of let themselves be guided by this depersonalized abstract thing called globalization, the global economy, which was the kind of common sense, from about 1995 to 2016. No politician of a major party in a Western country, industrialized country, would disagree. It would just be subtle variations on how you're supposed to bow down to the kind of the forces of globalization, right? When the backlash came, it kind of came in two forms. One from the left. In the United States, I would say the rupture was actually created by Bernie Sanders' success in the Democratic primary campaign in 2016, when he just, as he'd been saying for decades, like, no, we can't do that. We need to be attentive to the ways that globalization is transforming our country, often for the worse, and we need to answer with economic policies. And so economic policies led. Then when his message failed in the Democratic Party, was sort of cannibalized by Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, the economic language was used, but it wasn't actually followed through on. So what did Trump do as a president? Well, he drove through one of the biggest tax cuts in decades, and that's kind of the only thing that he did as a major policy decision. What did he have left was just the culture war. Same thing happened in Britain. Mm-hmm. You had Jeremy Corbyn, who was willing to make economic steps to actually change a globalized economic system to one in which there was more national control. That language of national control was picked up by the Conservatives, but they didn't actually have any means of following through on it. I think that the vision for Brexit was always driven by people who wanted to go global more than they wanted to actually, create some more forms of sort of national self-sustainability. So all they were left with then, as they are now, is the kind of culture war. So you get this very comical bifurcation now, where someone like Viktor Orban, for example, will be, wholeheartedly, full-throatedly opposing the globalists and arguing that George Soros has done everything bad to his country. But at the same time, he's inviting Samsung in, creating a special economic zone, one of the few in Europe, that gives them rights more than the other companies. And he's standing in the way of creating something like a global corporate minimum tax that the OECD was trying to roll out. So it's very important not to be fooled by the kind of the cultural smokescreen that I think is used. I think it is possible to restore some level of national sort of autonomy, even in a globalized world, but you need to take the economic side seriously and not be fooled into thinking that it's actually can be remedied through culture war or racist exclusionary policies.
I think that kind of brings me to my kind of final question about, so in your book it seems that there's a heavyweight title bouts between capitalism and democracy as we know it. So it's a two-part question, but who wins and how do we make sure democracy wins? Assuming that's what you want, not put words in your mouth.
It is. I mean, so one of the things that, I think there's two ways of answering that question. I think one thing I would say is that we need to be quite sort of clear-eyed about whether what we have at present is a healthy form of democracy already. So I think that in the United States, for example, there are ways that the democratic process is pretty broken. I mean, I think that the form of proportional representation through which Congress has elected, the fact that there's no cap on corporate donations, makes already the gerrymandering of electoral districts already makes the idea that we live in a kind of one person, one vote, sort of small r Republican polity, pretty dubious. So I think the one question is how can we reform democracy itself such that it comes closer to something that is worthy of the name? But then the other question is how can we prevent more and more of what it means to be part of a democracy besides the act of voting? If you think of democracy more broadly as the creation of a space within which people are able to have kind of contesting views about the good life, where there's some minimal form of distribution and redistribution so that there's a baseline of economic equality, I think that is being sort of privatized away into kind of a fee-for-service model more and more in the United States as in the UK. So I think that the question is really not who wins, capitalism or democracy. It's how can we contain the excesses of capitalism such that we have the chance to actually build up a democracy that in most cases we're not currently enjoying. So to do so would be, first and foremost, stop looking to places that practice openly authoritarian, undemocratic forms of capitalism as somehow models to which we should aspire to. I mean, that's to me the most grotesque and obvious thing that needs to be done. But secondly, restore power to people mostly in their workplaces, because I think workplace democracy is a category that's, extremely important. Extremely important because most people spend their days not under public government, but in the private government of the workplace, in which the boss is often kind of a tyrant or a despot. So restoring the ability of self-expression and collective self-organization on the job, for which there are hopeful signs in the UK and in the US, sort of recent strike waves, resurgence of union activism. I see that as much part of the restoration of democracy per se as those things that one would see as contained within the world of electoral politics alone.
Yeah, so join a union.
Join a union, absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. Quinn Slobodian, your new book, Crack Up Capitalism, is out next week, and I recommend that everyone goes out and buys it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.